January 11th, 1944. 11:17 a.m. over Germany. A German fighter explodes in a ball of fire and twisted metal ripped apart by a single burst from one American gun. The wreckage spirals downward, trailing black smoke across a frozen sky. Another German fighter brakes hard left. Too slow. The P-51 Mustang is already there, already firing, already climbing away, before the enemy pilot can react. Then another burst. Another kill. Below 60 bombers carrying 600 men watch in silence, unable to believe what they are seeing. One aircraft, one pilot, alone in a sky full of killers refusing to leave. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Stay with us because what comes next will change everything you thought you knew about courage. His name was James Howard. Before the war, he was nobody special. A Navy pilot turned missionary's son, a quiet man, who flew because he loved it, not because he wanted glory. But on this one morning over Germany, James Howard did something that commanders called impossible, that veterans called suicidal, and that 600 men who walked off their bombers alive would call the reason they survived. He took on 26 enemy fighters. Alone. For 37 minutes. With no wingman, no backup, and eventually, no ammunition. By the time it was over, he had destroyed or crippled 11 German aircraft and broken one of the most disciplined fighter forces in the Luftwaffe. This is the story of how one pilot rewrote the rules of air warfare, saved hundreds of lives, and earned the only Medal of Honor given to a fighter pilot in the entire European theater. But before we get to that frozen sky over Germany, we need to understand exactly how desperate things had become. Because in early 1944, the men flying those bombers weren't just at risk, they were being slaughtered. By the winter of 1943 into 1944, the American daylight bombing campaign over Europe was bleeding out. The numbers were staggering, and they were getting worse. On a single mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943, the United States Army Air Forces lost 60 bombers in one day. 600 men. Gone. Not wounded. Not captured. Dead or missing in one afternoon over enemy territory. The month before, another Schweinfurt raid cost 45 aircraft. Hundreds more bombers returned so badly damaged they were scrapped on arrival. The math was brutal. A bomber crew was expected to fly 25 missions before rotating home. Statistically, most of them would not survive long enough to reach that number. Men went to bed knowing the odds. They flew anyway because someone had to. The problem was altitude, speed, and exposure. B-17 Flying Fortresses were not fighter aircraft. They were massive, slow, and built to carry bombs, not to outrun or outfight the enemy. They flew in tight formations because massed gunfire from dozens of bombers was the only real defense they had. But that defense had limits. German fighter pilots learned quickly that if they attacked from the front, diving through the formation at high speed, the window of exposure was so short that the bomber gunners could barely track them. Head-on attacks began decimating formations. Crews called it the 12 o'clock problem. You heard the roar of an engine, you saw a flash, and then your aircraft was already on fire. American fighters were supposed to be the answer. P-47 Thunderbolts and early P-38 Lightnings flew escort alongside the bomber streams. But they had one catastrophic weakness: fuel. The early escorts simply did not have the range to fly deep into Germany and back. They could protect the bombers over France, over the coast, over the early legs of the mission. Then their fuel gauges forced them to turn for home. And the moment the escorts peeled off, the Luftwaffe pounced. German fighter controllers tracked the American formations from the moment they crossed the coast. They waited. They watched the escorts leave. And then, with patience and precision, they struck. The men inside those bombers knew the moment the escorts turned back. They felt it. Not because of anything they saw, but because of what appeared in the sky seconds later. Waves of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s organized, disciplined, and coming in from every angle. Some days, the bomber crews fought off the attacks. Some days they didn't. By early 1944, losses had become so severe that senior commanders were privately debating whether daylight bombing over Germany could continue at all. Something had to change. A new aircraft had entered service, a plane with drop tanks that extended its range dramatically, a plane fast enough to tangle with anything the Luftwaffe had. The North American P-51 Mustang. But a better aircraft meant nothing without pilots willing to use it to its absolute limit. That was where James Howard came in. Howard had not started the war flying over Germany. He had started it flying over China. Before the United States officially entered the conflict, Howard had volunteered with the American Volunteer Group, the legendary Flying Tigers, fighting alongside Chinese forces against Japanese air power. He was already a combat veteran when most American pilots were still in training. He had shot down at least 6 Japanese aircraft, developed instincts that classroom instructors cannot teach, and built a particular philosophy about air combat that would define everything he did over Germany. Howard believed that a fighter pilot's job was not to survive. It was to make the enemy unable to function. Disruption, aggression, relentless pressure. These were his weapons as much as his guns. After Pearl Harbor, he transferred to the Army Air Forces, eventually landing in England with the 354th Fighter Group, one of the first units equipped with the new P-51 Mustang. His record was solid, his skills exceptional, but he was still largely unknown outside his own squadron. He was 30 years old, calm, precise, and deeply serious about what it meant to protect the men in those bombers. On the morning of January 11, 1944, Howard took off from his base in England as part of the escort force for a major bombing raid on aircraft manufacturing plants deep inside Germany. The target was Oschersleben. The mission was exactly the kind that had been killing crews for months, a long flight over hostile territory against a fully alerted enemy defense network. Howard's orders were standard. Escort the bombers. Stay with them as long as fuel allowed. Peel off and return when ordered. He had flown missions like this before. He understood the routine. What he did not know yet was that this particular morning would test everything he believed about what a pilot owed to the men he was supposed to protect. The outbound leg of the mission was unremarkable. Howard flew his Mustang in formation with the rest of the escort, watching the bomber stream beneath him, scanning the horizon for threats. Then his squadron was vectored away to intercept a separate German force approaching from another angle. Standard procedure. Fighters were redirected constantly during large escort missions as the tactical picture shifted. Howard joined the intercept. By the time the engagement was over, he turned back toward the bomber stream. What he found was not what he expected. His entire squadron was gone, scattered by the fight, redirected, broken apart by the chaos of combat. He was alone, and the bombers were not. He counted the German fighters above the formation. 26, organized, circling above the B-17S like hawks above wounded animals preparing to commit. Howard checked his fuel, enough to get home barely if he turned west right now. He checked his guns. 6 50 caliber machine guns fully loaded, thousands of rounds. He looked at the bombers below. 60 aircraft, 600 men. Slow low on fuel themselves, their defensive formations already weakened by the long flight. He looked at the German fighters above. 26 of them veterans, coordinated, already beginning their attack runs. Any rational calculation said leave. Any doctrine said leave. No one would have blamed him. He was one pilot. He had done his job. The squadron was scattered through no fault of his own. There was no regulation, no order, no expectation that demanded he fight those odds alone. The Mustang did not turn west. Howard pushed his throttle to the firewall and dove at the German formation from above, closing at over 400 miles per hour, dropping out of the high-altitude sun like a hawk folding its wings. He picked his target with the precision of a man who had been doing this for years, not the nearest enemy fighter, not the easiest shot, but the formation leader, the pilot, whose authority was holding the attack together. 3 seconds of trigger pressure. 90 rounds. The German fighter came apart in the air, its wing separating cleanly, the fuselage tumbling away in a spiral of smoke. Howard did not watch it fall. He was already pulling up trading speed for altitude, climbing back above the formation, resetting for the next pass. Below him, inside the bombers, men pressed their faces to windows and gun turrets and watched something they had never seen before. One fighter moving like nothing their escorts had ever moved. Diving and climbing and diving again, always between the bombers and the enemy, always attacking, never retreating. Some of them started counting passes. Others started praying. All of them understood, without being told, that if that Mustang left, they were finished. Howard came again. And again. Dive, fire, climb, reset. He was using everything the P-51 had: its speed advantage in the dive, its superior climb rate, its turning radius at high speed. German pilots tried to follow him. They could not. They tried to coordinate against him. He refused to give them a stable target. He hit them from angles they did not expect, pressed attacks that should have been broken off, absorbed risks that no textbook would have sanctioned. One by one, the German formation began to fracture. Pilots who had entered the engagement with calm discipline were now reacting, instead of acting defensive, instead of offensive. Watching the Mustang, instead of watching the bombers. 37 minutes. That is how long it lasted. By the time American P-47 Thunderbolts arrived from the west in force, and the German fighters finally broke off and turned for home, Howard had fought them almost to a standstill with a single aircraft. His guns were empty. His fuel was nearly gone. Cannon rounds had torn holes through his wings. His cockpit heater had failed. His hands shook from cold and oxygen debt, and the physical violence of sustained high-G combat. But 60 bombers were still flying. 600 men were still alive. He followed them home. He had nothing left to give. It had been enough. In Part 2, we will see what happened when the intelligence reports landed on senior commanders' desks, how they reacted to gun camera footage showing one man holding off an entire enemy force, and how everything the Air Force thought it knew about escort doctrine was about to be torn apart and rebuilt from the ground up. Because James Howard's 37 minutes over Germany did not just save 600 lives, they changed how air war was fought. And the Germans, when they finally understood what had happened to their formation that morning, were not angry. They were afraid. 60 bombers, 600 men. One pilot with empty guns and a dying engine following them home across the English Channel on fumes and willpower alone. That was where we left James Howard, 37 minutes after he turned his Mustang toward 26 German fighters and refused to leave. The intelligence reports were already being written. The gun camera footage was being developed in darkrooms across England. And senior commanders were about to read something that would force them to make a decision that terrified them. Because what Howard proved over Germany on January 11, 1944, was not just that one man could be extraordinarily brave. It was that everything they had built their escort doctrine around was fundamentally wrong. And changing doctrine meant admitting failure. In the United States Army Air Forces in early 1944, that was almost as dangerous as flying over Germany. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Stay with us. Here is the number that should stop you cold. Before the introduction of long-range escort doctrine, American bomber crews in the 8th Air Force faced a statistical survival rate of less than 30% across a full tour of 25 missions. 30%. That means 7 out of every 10 men who flew deep into Germany did not finish their tour alive. Commanders knew this. They tracked it in classified reports that never reached the press back home. And the solution they kept returning to was more bombers, more formations, better defensive fire from the B-17s themselves. More of the same thing that was already failing. The idea that a single fighter pilot acting alone and aggressively could fundamentally reshape the equation had no place in their thinking. Until Howard landed his bullet-riddled Mustang and climbed out with shaking hands, and the reports began to stack up on General William Kepner's desk. Kepner commanded 8th Fighter Command. He was not a soft man. He had fought in the First World War, understood air power from its earliest days, and had built his career on careful, methodical thinking about how fighters should be used. His current doctrine was explicit. Escorts stayed close to the bombers. Fighters were defensive instruments. Their job was to absorb attacks, not to initiate them. Going offensive braking formation to hunt enemy fighters was considered reckless, undisciplined, and a violation of everything a good escort pilot was supposed to do. When the after-action reports from January 11th landed in front of him, Kepner read them twice. Then, he called his staff together and said something that no one in that room expected. "This changes things." Not everyone agreed. Brigadier General Jesse Oughton, who commanded the 65th Fighter Wing, pushed back hard in the meeting that followed. He had built his career on conservative air tactics. He had the kind of institutional authority that only comes from years of rank and political relationships carefully maintained. He sat across the table from Kepner's staff officers and made his position clear. "One pilot doing something extraordinary does not prove a doctrine," he said. "It proves that extraordinary pilots exist. You cannot build strategy around exceptions." The room went quiet. Oughton continued, "If we unleash fighters to go hunting, we strip the bombers of their close-in protection. One man survived 37 minutes. The next man who tries it alone gets shot down in 37 seconds, and then the bombers have no escort at all." It was not an unreasonable argument. That was what made it dangerous. It was precisely the kind of logical conservative thinking that sounded correct in a briefing room and got men killed over Germany. Kepner listened. He did not immediately respond. Instead, he ordered a full review of every escort mission flown over Germany in the past 6 months, with specific attention to the correlation between fighter aggressiveness and bomber survival rates. He gave his analysts 2 weeks. The answer when it came back was not subtle. On missions where fighter escorts engaged enemy formations proactively rather than waiting to be attacked, bomber losses dropped by an average of 42%. 42%. The data had been sitting in the files the entire time. Nobody had assembled it into a coherent argument until now. But Oughton had allies. Senior commanders in both 8th Bomber Command and at USAAF headquarters in Washington were deeply skeptical of changing a doctrine mid-campaign. The political risks were enormous. If they changed escort tactics and losses increased in the short term, careers would end. If they told the press and the public that the strategy they had been defending for months was wrong, the backlash would be severe. The internal resistance was not about air tactics. It was about institutional survival. And James Howard, still flying missions with the 354th Fighter Group, was about to become the unwilling center of a bureaucratic battle that could determine the future of the entire bombing campaign. Howard himself wanted no part of it. When intelligence officers pressed him for details about his January 11th engagement, he was characteristically brief. He sat in a wooden chair in a cold briefing room, his flight jacket still on, and gave them exactly what they needed, and nothing more. "I saw the Germans setting up on the bombers," he said. "My squadron was gone. I had fuel and ammunition, so I stayed." The officer across the table leaned forward. "You held off 26 enemy fighters alone for 37 minutes. You need to understand that what you did is being used right now to argue for a complete revision of fighter escort doctrine." Howard looked at him for a moment. "Then make sure whoever argues it knows that it almost didn't work," he said. "I got lucky 3 times. Any of those passes could have gone the other way." That honesty was exactly what Kepner needed, not a hero who claimed invincibility. A professional who had found a gap in the enemy's thinking and exploited it with precision, and who knew the difference between courage and recklessness. Kepner made his decision. He drafted a new directive to be implemented across all fighter groups equipped with the P-51 Mustang. Escorts would still protect the bombers, but they would do it by dominating the airspace around the formation, hunting enemy fighters before they could form up for attacks, pursuing threats aggressively rather than waiting to absorb them. The new philosophy had a simple name inside 8th Fighter Command. They called it the Hunter Doctrine, and on paper it was a revolution. The question was whether the men who had to fly it would believe in it enough to make it work. The first formal briefing of the new doctrine took place at Steeple Morden on February 8, 1944. Kepner stood in front of a room full of squadron commanders and group leaders, some of whom had been flying close escort missions for over a year, and told them that everything they had been trained to do was being revised. The room was not hostile. It was something worse. It was politely skeptical. These were experienced men. They had their own scars, their own losses, their own carefully built understanding of what kept them alive. A general telling them their instincts were wrong landed with a particular kind of silence that said everything without saying anything. Kepner did not argue. He showed them the numbers. Bomber loss rates before aggressive escort engagement. Bomber loss rates after. The 42% reduction sat on the briefing screen in plain black and white. Then he showed them the gun camera footage from January 11th. 37 minutes of one Mustang moving through 26 German fighters without braking, without retreating, forcing the entire enemy formation to react instead of attack. When the footage ended, the room was quiet for a different reason. One of the squadron commanders, a man named Colonel James Stone, who had flown more than 60 missions and had 3 kills to his name, raised his hand. "How many pilots have what Howard has?" he asked. Kepner looked at him. "That's the wrong question," he said. "Howard didn't win because of something magical. He won because he refused to be predictable. That's a skill, and skills can be taught." The training program that followed was compressed, intense, and deeply uncomfortable for pilots who had spent months developing muscle memory around a completely different set of instincts. Instructors used Howard's January 11th engagement as a case study, breaking down each pass, each climbing reversal, each targeting decision. They drilled the fundamental principle until it became automatic. Control the airspace. Do not wait for the enemy to come to you. Make them react to you. In the 6 weeks following the doctrine change, the 354th Fighter Group, Howard's own unit, flew 9 major escort missions. Bomber losses on those missions dropped by 38% compared to the 6 weeks prior. Enemy fighter losses, meanwhile, increased by nearly 60%. The Germans were encountering something they had not prepared for: American fighters that came to hunt instead of to guard. The Luftwaffe response was telling. German fighter controllers began changing their own tactics, pulling back from direct engagement with P-51 formations, trying to lure the escorts away from the bombers by staging diversionary attacks at altitude before committing to the real strike lower down. It was a sign of something significant. The Germans were no longer dictating the terms of engagement. They were responding to American pressure. For the first time in the European Air War, the initiative was shifting. And it had started with one man who turned his Mustang back toward 26 fighters on a January morning over Germany. Not because he was ordered to, but because he looked at 600 men in slow bombers and decided that leaving was not something he was capable of doing. But here is what the briefing rooms and the doctrine manuals and the after-action reports did not capture. Something was happening inside the Luftwaffe that American intelligence had not yet fully understood. German fighter units were not simply adapting to the new American tactics. They were doing something more calculated and more dangerous. In the weeks following January 11th, German commanders had begun collecting their own data. They had identified the P-51 Mustang's fuel and range limitations. They had studied the pattern of American escort rotations, and they had started developing a response that had nothing to do with meeting American fighters in the air. It had everything to do with hitting them on the ground. In March of 1944, reports began reaching 8th Fighter Command from resistance networks in France and the Netherlands. German long-range strike aircraft had been repositioned to forward airfields. New targets had been surveilled, and the targets were not bomber bases. They were fighter fields. The bases where the Mustangs sat, fueled and armed between missions. James Howard and every pilot who had just been handed a revolutionary new doctrine were about to discover that winning the air over Germany had painted a very large target on the ground beneath them. And in Part 3, we will see what happened when the Luftwaffe came not to fight, but to destroy, and whether the doctrine that one pilot's impossible 37 minutes had helped create was strong enough to survive the moment the enemy stopped reacting and started planning. The war was just beginning to change, and the price of changing it was about to get much higher. James Howard turned his Mustang toward 26 German fighters on January 11, 1944, and refused to leave. 600 men came home because of it. In Part 2, we watched that single act of defiance crack open a debate inside 8th Fighter Command that had been building for months. General Kepner read the data, saw the 42% drop in bomber losses when escorts went aggressive, and rewrote the doctrine that had been killing American crews since the campaign began. The Hunter Doctrine was born. P-51 pilots were unleashed. And for 6 weeks the numbers moved in America's favor. But we ended Part 2 with a warning. German intelligence had noticed. German commanders had started repositioning long-range strike aircraft toward forward airfields. Not to fight the Mustangs in the air, to destroy them on the ground. The experiment was over. The real war was starting. Here is what the Germans saw in their own after-action reports through February 1944. Enemy fighter-kill ratios against American bomber formations had dropped by over 50% in 6 weeks. 50%. For the Luftwaffe fighter arm, that was not a statistical fluctuation. That was a collapse. In January alone, German fighter units escorting or intercepting American formations had lost 94 pilots, killed or missing, against a figure roughly half that size in the same period the previous year. The Jagdwaffe, the German fighter force, was not short of aircraft. It was bleeding pilots. And pilots, unlike aircraft, could not be manufactured on a production line and delivered in 6 weeks. General Major Adolf Galland, one of the most experienced fighter commanders, the Luftwaffe had convened an emergency assessment in February 1944. The reports from January 11th had been analyzed carefully. What emerged from that analysis was something that disturbed the German High Command at a level beyond tactics. American fighter pilots were no longer behaving predictably. They had always been aggressive individually, but the new pattern showed something systemic. American escorts were initiating combat before German formations could commit to attack runs. They were hunting rather than guarding. And the P-51 Mustang, with its range extended by drop tanks, could now reach targets deep inside the Reich that German planners had assumed were safe from fighter escort. Berlin itself was no longer beyond reach. Galland told his superiors bluntly, the Mustang was the best fighter currently operating over Germany. If production and pilot losses continued at the current rate, the Jagdwaffe would be operationally ineffective by summer. His recommendation was immediate and controversial. Stop fighting the escorts. Concentrate everything on the bombers. Make the cost of sending bombers so high that the Americans would be forced to stop. Let the Mustang circle overhead with nothing to protect. The plan had a brutal logic. And in March of 1944, it began to produce results that terrified 8th Bomber Command. On March 6th, the first American raid targeting Berlin directly cost 69 bombers, 690 men, in a single day. The Hunter Doctrine was working in the air, but the sheer scale of what the Germans were throwing at the bombers when they bypassed the escorts was producing casualties that offset much of the tactical gain. Inside USAAF headquarters, voices that had opposed the doctrine change in February began raising them again. Auton's argument that stripping escorts away from close-in bomber protection was reckless suddenly had new ammunition. Kepner was under pressure from 2 directions simultaneously, and Howard, who had sparked the entire debate with 37 minutes over Oschersleben, was about to fly into the middle of the worst of it. The internal crisis that followed was not dramatic in the way that combat is dramatic. It was quiet, procedural, and deeply corrosive. A series of mission reports from early March showed instances where P-51 pilots pursuing German fighters aggressively under the new doctrine had moved far enough from the bomber stream that when a second wave of attackers came in low and fast, there were no escorts in position to intercept. 3 bombers lost on one mission, 4 on another, not catastrophic numbers individually, but enough for commanders who wanted to reverse the doctrine to point at specific aircraft and specific crews and say these men died because the fighters were not there. Howard sat in the briefing rooms and listened to those arguments and understood something that the commanders arguing about doctrine did not fully appreciate. They were comparing an imperfect new system to an idealized memory of the old one. The old system had been losing 7 out of 10 crews before their tours ended. Nobody was arguing to go back to those numbers. But grief and blame do not respond to statistics. They respond to faces and names. Then, April 8, 1944 arrived, and everything changed again. The target was aircraft production facilities at Brunswick, Germany. Deep penetration, heavy defenses, the kind of mission that had been producing catastrophic losses for months. 277 B-17 and B-24 took off from bases across England in the pre-dawn darkness. The escort force included multiple P-51 groups flying under the revised Hunter Doctrine with clear instructions to dominate the airspace aggressively and intercept German formations before they could organize attack runs on the bombers. Howard flew that mission. He was not in command of the strike force. He was one pilot among hundreds. But what happened over Brunswick on April 8th became a textbook demonstration of everything the new doctrine was designed to achieve. The German response came early. Luftwaffe controllers had learned to read American formation patterns. They vectored 2 large groups of Focke-Wulf 190s toward the bomber stream from the northwest, aiming to catch the formation before it reached the target. Standard interception. Well executed. It should have worked. It didn't. The lead P-51 group saw them first. 12,000 feet above the German fighters positioned with altitude and sun advantage. The bounce was clean and fast. No warning for the German formation leaders. No time to set up defensive positions. The P-51s came down at over 400 miles per hour, firing in short, precise bursts, targeting the formation leaders exactly as Howard had done over Oschersleben in January. The German formation shattered in the first 30 seconds of contact. 7 Focke-Wulfs destroyed in the opening pass. 3 more damaged and breaking away. The survivors scattered. Below, the bombers pressed on. A second German force appeared from the south. Messerschmitt 109s flying in a tight staggered formation, angling for a head-on pass at the front of the bomber stream. Exactly the attack profile that had been killing B-17 crews for a year. The intercept came from the right. A flight of 4 Mustangs that had been holding high cover dropped onto the 109s from their blind side before the German pilots could commit to their attack run. The lead Messerschmitt took hits in the engine and broke downward streaming coolant. His wingman turned hard left and flew directly into the sights of the second American element. 2 more kills. The formation attack collapsed before it reached the bombers. The German controllers threw everything they had. Wave after wave. Each time the P-51s were in position. Aggressive, hunting, refusing to let the German formations organize. Not every interception was clean. Not every engagement went the American way. One P-51 pilot went down near Brunswick, his aircraft hit by cannon fire from a 190 that came out of the sun with genuine skill. 2 bombers took hits and turned for home with wounded aboard. War does not produce clean ledgers. But when the mission landed back in England that evening and the mission reports were compiled, the numbers told a story that silenced every argument that had been made in the previous 3 weeks about rolling back the Hunter Doctrine. American bomber losses on the Brunswick raid, 11 aircraft, against a comparable mission to a comparable target 3 months earlier, 43. The German fighter losses in the air battle over and around Brunswick, 31 confirmed, destroyed 14 more probable kills. 31 aircraft and the pilots inside them, gone in a single afternoon. For the Luftwaffe, April 8th was not a defeat. It was a hemorrhage. The pilot who survived the Brunswick engagement and filed one of the most detailed after-action reports was a captain named Robert Johnson, flying with the 56th Fighter Group. His report was unusual for its precision. He described the moment the first P-51 bounce connected with the German formation below as something close to shock. Not at the violence, but at the speed with which the tactical situation reversed. They were organized, and we were already on them before they had time to react, he wrote. The doctrine works. Not because the pilots are better, because we are faster and higher, and they are not ready for us to come down like that. That report reached Kepner within 48 hours. He forwarded it to USAAF headquarters in Washington with a single handwritten note attached. The argument is over. Within 2 weeks of the Brunswick mission, the Luftwaffe began implementing the changes Galland had proposed. Concentrate on the bombers. Avoid the escorts. Accept that air superiority over Germany was no longer achievable in direct combat. It was a strategic admission of defeat at the fighter level. The German High Command would never publicly acknowledge it, but the numbers recorded it in absolute terms. In March 1944, the Luftwaffe flew approximately 500 fighter sorties per week against American bombing missions. By June, that number had dropped to below 200. Not because aircraft were unavailable, because experienced pilots were not. The Hunter Doctrine had taken a German fighter force that had been winning and had spent it down to something that could no longer dictate terms over its own territory. American bomber crew survival rates inside the 8th Air Force shifted measurably through the spring and summer of 1944. The 30% full-tour survival rate that had been quietly recorded in classified reports through 1943 moved toward 50% by May, then higher. It was still a brutal calculation. Men were still dying over Germany in large numbers. But the mathematics of survival had fundamentally changed. And that change traced directly to a doctrine that had been resisted, argued over, and nearly reversed multiple times before the evidence from missions like Brunswick made it impossible to deny. The 354th Fighter Group Howard's Unit ended the war as the top-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force by confirmed aerial kills. The P-51 Mustang became synonymous with the shift in European air power. By the fall of 1944, American fighters were ranging freely over Germany, hitting airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground, degrading the Luftwaffe's ability to mount any meaningful resistance. The air war over Europe had changed not because of superior numbers alone, but because of a doctrine that taught pilots to control the sky rather than merely occupy it. Howard received his Medal of Honor on a cold English morning in late February 1944. He stood at attention. He accepted the medal. He said very little. He flew his next mission 2 days later. But here is the question that Part 3 leaves unanswered. We know what James Howard's 37 minutes over Germany did to the war. We know the doctrine it helped create. We know the lives it saved in aggregate, in cold statistical terms. What we have not fully reckoned with is what it cost the man himself, and what happened in the years after the war ended when the uniform came off and the sky went quiet. Because the story of January 11, 1944 does not end with a medal. It does not end with victory. It ends with a man who walked away from something extraordinary and spent the rest of his life not quite able to explain why he stayed. And in Part 4, we will follow James Howard into that silence and ask a question that military history rarely asks about its heroes. What does it mean to carry something like this? And what does one moment cost the person who lived inside it? The story has one chapter left, and it is the one that matters most. From a single act of refusal on January 11, 1944, James Howard turned his Mustang toward 26 German fighters and held them back for 37 minutes with nothing but skill nerve and eventually an empty gun. In Part 2, That act broke open a doctrinal debate that had been quietly killing American bomber crews for months, and General Kepner rewrote the rules of escort warfare. In Part 3, the Hunter Doctrine proved itself over Brunswick on April 8, 1944, shattering German fighter formations that had been organized and disciplined and utterly unprepared for American fighters that came hunting instead of guarding. The Luftwaffe began to bleed out. The air war over Europe shifted. And we ended Part 3 with a question that military history rarely stops long enough to ask. What happens to the man after the moment that defines him? What does it cost to carry something like January 11th for the rest of your life? Because this story has one chapter left, and it is the one that most people never hear. James Howard came home from the war quietly. No ticker tape parade with his name on the banners. No book deal. No speaking circuit. No Hollywood meeting. He was 31 years old when Germany surrendered in May 1945. A decorated combat veteran with more than enough reasons to walk away from the sky forever. He did not walk away. He stayed in uniform, transitioned to jets as the Air Force modernized through the late 1940s, and spent years as a test pilot and instructor, passing on to younger men the instincts that no classroom had taught him and no manual had fully captured. He was methodical about it, patient in a way that people who had never seen him in combat would not have expected from someone capable of what he had done over Oschersleben. The pilots he trained remembered him as demanding, but never reckless. He pushed them toward aggression, but always with discipline underneath it. Speed without purpose, he told them, was just noise. Aggression without precision was just dying faster. The men from the bomber crews found him in the years after the war. They came quietly the way they had come to his airfield in England in January 1944, without cameras or commanders. A letter here, a phone call there. One gunner who had watched the entire 37-minute engagement from his turret tracked Howard down in the early 1950s and drove 4 hours to shake his hand. He told Howard the same thing he had told him in England, that he had watched from inside the glass and aluminum of his ball turret, counting every pass, certain he was about to die, and that the Mustang never left. Howard listened. He nodded. He did not say much. That was always how he handled it. Not false modesty, not deflection. Just a genuine difficulty with the gap between what those men experienced watching from below and what he had experienced doing it, which was mostly just a series of decisions made very fast, with very limited information, none of which had felt historic in the moment. They had felt necessary. He retired from the Air Force in 1965 with the rank of Brigadier General. 20 years of service after the war ended. 20 years of flying newer and faster aircraft over a world that had been permanently reshaped by the conflict he had helped decide. He settled in Florida and lived a life that the men who knew his name from history books would have found surprisingly ordinary. He gardened. He fished. He followed aviation news with the careful attention of a man who had built his identity around understanding how machines moved through air. He gave occasional interviews when researchers and journalists tracked him down, always precise in his recollections, always careful to push back when the story began to drift toward mythology. He had not been invincible over Germany. He had been prepared and committed and fortunate in roughly equal measure, and he wanted that on the record. James Howard died on March 18, 1995, at the age of 81. He had outlived most of the men who had watched him fight from those bomber turrets. He had outlived the aircraft he flew, the commanders who had argued over his doctrine, and the enemy pilots he had met in the air over Germany 50 years before. He died as he had lived after the war, quietly, and the world largely did not notice, because the world had long since moved on to other stories. But the men who knew what January 11th had actually cost him understood something that the medals and the citations in the history books did not fully convey. Howard had given 37 minutes of everything he had over Germany. He had spent the next 50 years giving the rest of it one student pilot and one careful interview, and one letter answered at a time to making sure the thing he had learned in that frozen sky was not wasted. The doctrine he helped prove did not stay in Europe. It followed American air power into every conflict that came after, refined and adapted, but built on the same foundational principle that Kepner had written into the Hunter Directive in early 1944. Control the airspace. Do not wait for the enemy to commit. Take the initiative and make them react to you. In Korea, American F-86 Sabres flying against Soviet-built MiG-15ES operated on escort and air superiority principles that traced directly back to the lessons of the 8th Air Force. The kill ratios American pilots achieved over Korea, roughly 10-1 against MiG pilots in comparable aircraft, reflected training and doctrine that had been built from the wreckage of the early bombing campaigns over Germany. In Vietnam, the picture was more complicated. American pilots flying technically superior aircraft against North Vietnamese MiGs in the 1960s achieved kill ratios that were far less dominant, and the Air Force and Navy responded by returning to basics, rebuilding aggression, and initiative training from the ground up. The Navy established its famous Fighter Weapons School in 1969, which would become known to the public as Top Gun, and its core curriculum was built around exactly the principles that James Howard had demonstrated without being asked to in January 1944. Engage first. Control the geometry. Never let the enemy choose the terms. The P-51 Mustang itself became a benchmark that influenced aircraft design for a generation after the war. Its combination of range speed and maneuverability at altitude set standards that jet-age designers used as baseline reference points. The principle of the long-range escort, the idea that fighters could and should accompany strike aircraft all the way to the target and back, became foundational to every Air Force that studied American operations in Europe. At least 14 nations rebuilt their post-war air doctrines around the escort and air superiority principles proven over Germany between 1944 and 1945. The specific lessons of missions like January 11th and April 8th were translated into doctrine manuals, war college curricula, and training programs that shaped how pilots thought about their role in the air for decades. One man's 37 minutes over Germany became in aggregate something that is almost impossible to quantify but impossible to dismiss. Conservative estimates of bomber crew lives saved by the shift to aggressive escort doctrine through the final 14 months of the European air campaign run above 12,000. 12,000 men who completed tours they would not have survived under the old system. 12,000 futures that extended beyond the war because the mathematics of survival had changed. The deeper lesson that Howard's story carries is not about air power or aircraft design, or even tactical doctrine. It is about the relationship between institutions and the individuals who challenge them. Kepner's staff had the data showing that aggressive escort tactics reduced bomber losses by 42%. That data existed before January 11th. It was sitting in files that nobody had assembled into a coherent argument because the institutional pressure to maintain existing doctrine was stronger than the analytical case for changing it. Howard did not provide new information. He provided an undeniable demonstration performed in front of 60 bomber crews, who then filed reports that could not be ignored, that forced the institution to look at information it already possessed and act on it. This is the pattern that repeats throughout military history and beyond it. The Wright brothers were told heavier than air flight was impractical by people who had already done the mathematics proving it was possible. Chester Nimitz advocated for submarine warfare doctrine that the Navy had classified as too aggressive for 2 decades before Pearl Harbor made it necessary. Percy Spencer discovered microwave cooking by accident in 1945, and the technology that became the microwave oven spent 10 years being dismissed as a laboratory curiosity by institutions with no framework for understanding its commercial potential. The idea is rarely the problem. The institution is almost always the problem, and changing institutions requires not better arguments, but better evidence presented in circumstances where the cost of ignoring it becomes higher than the cost of accepting it. Howard understood this without articulating it. When intelligence officers pressed him for details after January 11th, he gave them exactly what they needed to make the argument he could not make himself as a junior pilot in a hierarchical organization. He knew that the story his guns told was more persuasive than anything he could say in a briefing room. He gave them the evidence and stepped back. That restraint, that understanding of how institutions actually change, was as important to what followed as the flying itself. Now, here is the detail that most accounts of James Howard's story do not include, and which only emerged clearly in documents declassified in the 1990s. After the January 11th mission, German intelligence produced an assessment of the engagement that was captured after the war and translated by American historians. The assessment was clinical and precise in the way that good intelligence work always is. It identified Howard's tactics correctly. It noted the targeting of formation leaders. It flagged the use of altitude and sun advantage on the opening pass. It correctly assessed that the American pilot had operated without wingman support for the duration of the engagement. And then it included a line that no American after-action report contained, because no American had been in a position to observe it. 3 of the German pilots who broke off the engagement and turned for home that morning did so not because their aircraft were damaged or their ammunition was exhausted. They broke off because in the assessment's precise language, the American pilot's behavior was assessed as irrational and therefore unpredictable, and engaging an irrational opponent at a numerical disadvantage per aircraft was considered tactically unsound. They left because Howard confused them. He stayed when the math said leave attacked, when the math said defend pressed, when the math said disengage. And veteran pilots trained to read combat rationally did not have a framework for processing an opponent who had apparently abandoned rational calculation. What they had identified as irrationality was, of course, something else entirely. It was commitment so complete that it had moved beyond calculation into something that looked from the outside like a different category of human behavior altogether. The Germans called it irrational. The 600 men in those bombers called it the reason they came home. From a missionary's son who learned to fly because he loved the sky, to the only fighter pilot awarded the Medal of Honor in the European theater during the Second World War, James Howard proved something that doctrine manuals cannot teach, and that institutions consistently fail to reward until the evidence is impossible to deny. That one person in the right place at the right moment, refusing to accept the calculation that everyone else has already accepted, can bend the arc of events in ways that extend far beyond what any single individual should reasonably be able to do. 12,000 lives. 14 nations. 50 years of doctrine. All of it traces back to 37 minutes and one decision made at 11:17 in the morning over Germany. Not because he was ordered to stay, not because the math supported it, because he looked at 600 men who could not protect themselves and decided with total clarity and no hesitation that leaving was simply not something he was capable of doing. And that is why decades after the last Mustang landed and the last bomber shut down its engines, his story still matters. Not as a monument to what one man can destroy, but as proof of what one person can save when they refuse, at the moment, that counts to turn away.